Welcome, everyone. My name is April Johnson. I am the Executive Director of Preservation Durham, and I have here Kofi Boone. Kofi, can you hear me? Okay. Kofi is the Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at North Carolina State University in the College of Design. He is a Detroit native and graduate of the University of Michigan. He has worked in landscape architecture and environmental justice with a focus on democratic design and cultural landscapes. He is a university faculty scholar and a member of the Academy of Outstanding Teachers. He's a teaching professional, and professional work has earned his students and himself professional awards. So I want to welcome Kofi Boone. Today, again, my name is April Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of Preservation Durham. We are your nonprofit historic preservation organization. And we are still here. We want to continue to have these talks. We know that we are not able to meet in person, but this is a great opportunity for us to expand our reach and talk about things that expand what we know and think and believe about preservation. So welcome, Kofi. I look forward to this conversation, and please feel free to ask questions, and he'll be around to answer questions at the end. Take it over, Kofi.
All right. Well, thank you for the invitation. Thanks to everybody who decided to sign on today, this beautiful sunny day. And I hope that we can get into a good conversation. I'm going to start the screen share from my end. And hopefully my desktop is not too messy for everybody. All right, well, thanks. I admire the work that Preservation Durham is doing. Until recently, April was a neighbor, so we got a chance to kind of see how the community was changing over time, dealing with history. I teach landscape architecture, which a lot of people don't make a direct tie with preservation and with cultural places, but there are ties, and I've spent a lot of my professional career looking at this, but also looking at it through the lens of social equity and particularly racial equity. So that'll be the theme for today, and entertain some questions as they come across. I'll talk about some broader patterns and trends that inform the way that I look at it. I'll share a couple of case studies in North Carolina, working with communities on ways to communicate their stories and help them build upon their heritage, and close with a few recommendations that are pertinent to at least my vantage point of how things are going in our own backyard. So we'll start with this. One of our most famous residents passed away recently, Phil Freelon. That's him in front of his signature work, the Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian. And I had a chance to visit it for the first time a few months ago before the quarantine, before the lockdown, and, had to, wait in line 90 minutes to get in the door, and it was packed all the way through, and the line was bigger when I left. And so, that communicates to me that there's an appetite for another kind of story, another way of telling the story that we all think we know, but from different points of view, and realizing that a museum is one thing, the community is another. And in our own backyard in Durham, we've been dealing with a number of issues in terms of the balance of preserving stories, enhancing stories, using stories to empower communities with the growth imperative that hits our entire region. And so, this image that we're all familiar with, Paris Street, Black Wall Street, in the midst of new structures, new growth, new pressures. And I was surprised to receive a call from the New York Times last year asking about Raleigh, which will be one of the case studies that we'll talk about in this call, and that their own independent analysis at the New York Times identified Raleigh as not only one of the fastest gentrifying communities, but one of the main communities that are transforming from Black to white, and the tensions that are coming from that. And so we got into a very rich conversation about that particular topic and trying to figure out why and what people do about it. And the relevance of it is that, just in my lived experience, that a lot of Black and brown communities for parts of the 20th century found themselves close to city centers. And those areas got extended disinvestment. And then when cities became attractive for reinvestment and growth imperatives came and started to shift from suburbs to central cities, a lot of folks were caught in between these two major trends. And so, I started to try and think about why that occurs and how that impacts our ability to work with local communities, to build trust and to build the relationships required, and to be honest about the trends, and to, where possible, enable them to benefit from these trends. And although we talk about placemaking a lot, another term that we talk about is placekeeping. The idea that placemaking in some community contexts, and particularly from an equity lens, is defined in some ways by the values of outsiders to particular communities, how to transform them, make them more attractive for people who aren't actually there. And placekeeping emerged as sort of a grassroots push against that, to sort of amplify and elevate the stories of residents, people who are actually there, and to encourage reinvestment in a manner that suits the daily lives of people that are there. But it's this tension of placemaking and placekeeping in some ways that informs this resistance to displacement movement, which I think in some ways has extended to resistance to particular preservation efforts for a number of reasons. One is the long time frame, and my friend Mindy Fuller Thompson, author of the book Root Shock, laid it out pretty well. And I had a chance to see her in Pittsburgh right before the quarantine as well, and we talked about this again. She is a clinical psychiatrist and an urbanist, and she has studied for decades the changes that have happened, particularly in New York City and in Pittsburgh and other places, and has talked about the psychological impacts of losing your home place. So whether you are relocated, or your community was destroyed in urban renewal, or you were in some ways forced to find another place to live, there's a traumatic response, which she calls root shock. And in her mind, she starts to look at particularly American history and the relationships between white people and Black and brown people, and the politics of it, as a series of serial displacement, shocks to the system that have happened from time to time. And I think that this is a really useful framework for understanding why some communities start to translate what are seen as goods, right? We need to invest in these communities, celebrate their history, restore facilities, get them occupied, get them moving, but somehow that gets communicated as another emphasis of displacement. And it's because it's happened a lot. One thing we talk about a lot is that the United States is extremely segregated. It's not a mystery, but sometimes it's useful to just kind of state that and talk about a lot of the politics between communities, particularly in the context of race, play within this framework of racial segregation. And the South is an extreme example of that in some ways. In our own backyard in Durham, we're aware of the history of redlining. So in the early 20th century, during the Great Depression, the development of loan tools to assist communities that wanted to reinvest in their homes and reinvest in their businesses, and the methodology by which they did that, which was essentially windshield surveys of Black populations in communities. And those places, as you can see on the left and the right, from a street survey to a red line map, the red line, of course, indicating no access to these particular loan programs, coincides and reinforces over generations that sense that some communities are more important than others, that some communities get more resources than others, and the long-term impacts of disinvestment and struggle for resources in persistent areas. I lived in, and April lives in, one of the red line areas right now on the Durham map, and so we're able to see that in real time. And the physical destruction of assets. And so some communities are asset rich. You know, they manage to self-organize, they manage to reinvest, they manage to protect their boundaries. And you can enjoy the built environmental qualities of historic homes, great trees, you know, walkable streets, you know, local businesses. And then some no, you know, and in our case in Durham, we're still dealing with the scars of the Durham Freeway and with urban renewal. It's not unique to Durham. There are about 160 communities across the United States that went through the exact same thing. most of them Black and brown. And the idea that in the mid 20th century, the belief in the Red Scare, the fear of nuclear annihilation at the hands of the Soviet Union led to federally funded dispersal of urban populations, of which African American populations and Black populations, at least their physical infrastructure, are one of the casualties. And so these are before and after pictures of the Hayti community in Durham, before and after the Durham Freeway. You may recognize the Hayti Heritage Center in the center of the picture on the right. That's what it was surrounded by historically on the left. And so this is still in the living memory of many people. And there's some folks who talk about, bringing up the issue of race and bringing up these inequities is sort of old news. It doesn't have any real impact on how we make decisions today, but I think it has direct impact on current things, particularly wealth accumulation, and explaining the imbalance between Black and white communities. So this Brookings study from 2018, which of course takes into account the home foreclosures and the mortgage crisis of 2008, but even accounting for that, there has been systematic devaluation of homes between Black and white communities. Raleigh in particular, it's about 11%, so an equivalent home in an equivalent style neighborhood, just one in a white neighborhood, one in a Black neighborhood, results in the Black home valuation being, $11,000 less. So the ability for people who have been paying their mortgages and have been paying their rents and have been good citizens, still resulting in a net loss in wealth that could be invested in education and health and retirement and other things, is a persistent problem. And to get to the chase, the disparities in household wealth, as a landscape architect and someone who's in the built environmental professions, this is a major factor in terms of people's level of participation, agency, trust, navigation through the existing mechanisms that are designed to help communities. We're talking about 120% in some cases wealth disparity, largely tied to equity in one's home between Black and white, and Black households are on a trajectory to zero U.S. household wealth within a generation without any disruption. So there are a lot of factors that kind of frame where we are, and in our case, this sort of tension between a fast-growing region with big investment, renewed interest in preserving and exploring regional histories, and then people who have been in these intractable positions the entire time in the exact same space. That's sort of the tension that particularly defines the South. And so, this study from Raj Chetty, which was profiled in the New York Times in 2013, measuring upward mobility, that Charlotte actually has the lowest upward mobility in the nation. That it has the lowest chance for someone in the lowest percentile of wealth, that's African American, from getting out of that lowest percentile. And it ties to a lot of the things that we've talked about before, but primarily household wealth and income tied to home ownership and home value. So it's a major issue, and it's where we all operate. It's so major that it's daunting, and that it's very difficult to figure out where to start, how to work. But what we've tried to do is to think about how we can contribute to resilience. And in the broader literature, dealing with trauma or dealing with displacement, the idea of social cohesion is a big idea that a lot of contemporary ways of thinking about, at least public realm, are starting to gravitate. This diagram came from a study after Superstorm Sandy in New York and New Jersey, trying to understand the social dynamics that contributed to some communities recovering faster from devastation than others. And there are a lot of factors, but they arrived at the communities that had the highest levels of social cohesion were the most resilient. And so, opportunities to build people's social mobility, as was sort of critiqued by Chetty before, how can we think about the role that heritage and investment can play in communities that help people move up that ladder. Building social capital. So, there's an incredible amount of distrust in a lot of communities, and, low levels of civic participation. How can those strategies actually enhance social cohesion in communities? and social exclusion. So, acknowledging that in some cases, where people want to be and how they want to be networked and connected is not where they are. And so helping people make those connections and build those networks are all components of social cohesion. So as those three move, social cohesion moves. And how can the built environment and built environmental professionals like us deal with that phenomenon? So what I wanted to offer to the group is the opportunity to think about how preservation efforts and reinvestment in heritage can build social cohesion, and to pursue it as an equitable heritage strategy, a way of addressing issues of equity. And one of the cases I want to talk about is the South Park Heritage Walk in Raleigh, which we had a lot of contact with for almost a decade now. And I'll walk through some of that information. I'm shocked by how many of my students in Raleigh have never been to Durham, so I won't assume that everybody in Durham spends a lot of time in Raleigh. But downtown Raleigh, state capital, just south and east of Raleigh, and for many years, an undeveloped part of the city, South Park in East Raleigh. South Park designed essentially as a streetcar suburb for African Americans, for Black people, but dates back to Freedmen's Land right after the Civil War. And early in Raleigh's history, it was illegal for Black folks and African Americans to live within the city limit of Raleigh. So people self-built communities on the fringes and on the edges, and this was one of the most prominent ones. South Park is probably most well known for being the home of Shaw University, which is one of the first HBCUs in the United States, and and significant for a lot of ways. In the middle of South Park is Chavis Park. Chavis Park, named after John Chavis, who was one of the first educators in North Carolina who could educate Black and white people. Interestingly enough, not at the same time. White people during the day, Black people at night. Point of controversy, but this is where he's from. And in the early 20th century, as a part of the New Deal, elements that came out of the Roosevelt administration was public housing and the introduction of sort of comprehensive mixed-use planning as a way of dealing with communities. And so taken as a whole, the schools, the housing, and the park, which at that time was known as the Negro Park, were all master planned at the same time, and actually was one of the first mixed-use master plans in Raleigh. Was this particular effort. It was a segregated sort of mixed-use community in terms of its vision. And the park itself, which was home to Negro League baseball teams, football and track competitions from Shaw University and nearby St. Augustine's College, and it really was sort of an epicenter of Black life for many years, but had fallen into disrepair. So the renovation and the change to Chavis Heights public housing brought more attention to the park. The relocation of a key facility in the park triggered community resistance to changes happened in the neighborhood, which they interpreted as gentrification and eventually their displacement for a lot of reasons. So one of the things that we understood, initially was that, the official story, if you go to the archives, if you go to, traditional methods of getting information, it was not sort of describing the dynamics that the folks in the community were really articulating and wanting to hear. And so we tried a lot of different things. We did what you all do. We had, many workshop meetings in community centers and churches. We did surveys. We did a lot of the things, but it became clear that we still weren't quite getting at, their perception and what they really saw as value there. And so one idea was this was the advent, this shows how old I am, this was the advent of smartphones that were able to very easily record digital videos and geotag them, georeference them, so that whenever you record a video, there's a pin on it that tells you where it was shot and what time and all that stuff. So we worked with AT&T, and they donated a number of phones and free service for a month. And we did training sessions with seniors and elders in the community who kept the history, and in exchange for the training, allowed them to keep the phones and be able to shoot their own self-authored digital video stories of their neighborhood in their own words. And And that process, it's very rare when these processes are like for real fun. So I like this picture for a lot of reasons, but this is when they finally figured out how to actually make the process work. It resulted in dozens and dozens of stories that primarily gravitated on the park and changed the perception of the value of the park. Through their stories, we were able to go through archival research and discover that, this was one of the few considered safe places for African-American entertainers and political leaders that were moving through the South at the time. So between Atlanta, Georgia, and Washington, D.C., there were numerous references to Chavis Park and to the African-American business section of downtown Raleigh as safe harbor, safe place. So you find everybody, jazz greats, band leaders, political leaders, everyone kind of coming through using the facilities. But there was very little trace evidence in the park that was true. And so, from a physical infrastructure standpoint, it didn't meet the bar for recognition. But stories helped to provoke additional research. And one of the biggest elements that came out of these particular videos was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, founded by Ella Baker and many others at Shaw University, which is a block away from Chavis Park. They actually started earlier in the park. This image is from Mississippi, but similar nonviolent direct action trainings, particularly self-defense techniques for African-American women who had to go into really hostile areas and learn how to basically take care of themselves. All that stuff happened in Chavis Park. And so its ability to serve as a sign and a symbol of civil rights history, of regional history, beyond just the physical park components, which sometimes people associate with just leisure. And so this started to change the way that the narrative was being told about the park. Started to rally other people that previously weren't really particularly interested. And the videos themselves started to travel on their own and go to other people in other places who weren't familiar with the story. This process led to identifying a number of historic sites and working with community folks to define a self-guided walking tour through South Park, now known as the Heritage Walk. And along the way, recommendations for really strategic infrastructure improvements to help amplify that particular story. Two that were already approved soon after the report came out were integrating elements of the Heritage Walk into Chavis Park, which we had noted, as well as Moore Square, which was recently reopened and has markers at several of the entries that talk about Black and African American history as a part of that particular park. Chavis Park in particular got a $12.5 million bond issue and is currently in phase 1 renovations after a generation of decline and decay. And that story is told in Landscape Architecture magazine. They did a very good profile on it that talked about not just the physical improvements to come, but the collaborations that occurred and the ways that community voices were amplified and were heard through the process. The next case I'd like to share is Greater Princeville, which is in Princeville, North Carolina. And that's an ongoing effort. And just as background, Hurricane Matthew 3 years ago came through and devastated, much of Eastern North Carolina. And as a college, in the College of Design, we rallied and we said, look, there's got to be something we can do. And so we began to engage various communities in Eastern North Carolina and more long-term strategies. And what we found is that federal investment, FEMA and other entities, they have a time limit on how much they can give and at what time. And a lot of these communities, particularly small ones that don't have a lot of capacity, they get kind of overloaded with resources and overloaded with expertise and overloaded with things immediately following the event, but then there are extended periods of no contact and no real capacity building. And so we felt we could fill some of that void, not completely, but we could play a role. This is from an article from the Cultural Landscape Foundation. If people aren't familiar with that organization, it's a great one led by Charles Birnbaum, which talks about cultural landscapes, landscapes that high design, low design, everywhere in between, and why they're significant. And we were lucky enough to have Princeville accepted as one of those, founded as Freedom Hill in 1865. renamed Princeville after Turner Prince in 1885. And interesting enough, the federal government wanted them to rename it Garfield Town, excuse me, then President Garfield. But the folks in Princeville at that time organized and rallied and said, no, we want to rename it after someone who really made a major difference and made a major contribution in our community. So that's indicative of the level of organization and really in some ways the level of power that they had. But in summary, it's the oldest Black town in the United States. It was the first one. It's before Mound Bayou. It's before Eatonville. And it's only an hour away. But because of its location on the Tar River, particularly in the lowland, and there's a whole sidebar, this conversation about racialized topography, which is communities who were relegated to land that people knew was under threat, even back then, for flooding, for hurricane, for other hazards, particularly after the Civil War. Low-lying land, there's a preponderance of Black and brown communities in low-lying areas, particularly of this time, and this is one of them. So that's sort of some background. This is a map to kind of show its relationship on the low side of the Tar River, the high side being Tarboro, the county seat. Where Freedom Hill is located, historically, it's interesting that Shiloh Landing, which is to the right of this diagram, was the southernmost navigable section of the Tar River coming from Virginia. And so what used to happen was that enslaved African people were brought down the Tar River to Shiloh Landing and then made to walk through and across the bend to where Freedom Hill happened to be, across the Tar River to Town Common Park. Town Common Park, a gorgeous park in the middle of Tarboro, but part of its history, it does have a Confederate monument. It does not have a marker that talks about its role as a slave auction area. And so part of our research requires us to kind of dig in and grapple with some of that particular history to get some context. And because of hurricanes, and because of something else I'll talk about in a second, there's not a lot of physical trace evidence of the qualities of the town that people really associated themselves with. So every once in a while, you'll find houses that are from that era. So the Turner Prince house, which still exists in some states of disrepair. But and the old town hall is gone, and the old bridge is gone, but the old grocery is gone. But what we found, in addition to hurricane damage, is that in the 1970s there was a redevelopment effort where the state worked with the town of Princeville and trade for redevelopment resources, because a lot of these buildings were extremely dilapidated and out of disrepair. They demolished and removed a lot of structures, and in their place replaced them with mid-century sort of eclectic mix of structures, which ironically now there's not a critical mass of historic structures to allow the town to be designated an historic district, which sounds crazy because it is the oldest Black town in the United States, but because of hurricanes and because of redevelopment, it doesn't have the physical infrastructure at this point to qualify as an historic district, to meet that minimum threshold of integrity. And so that's something we were grappling with quite a bit as a part of this effort. The other part we were grappling with was that nobody really knows the Princeville story, outside of this region. And so we wanted to start to introduce new people and new populations to the story. And so this group is the Enviro Kids. They're a Raleigh-based youth outreach environmental education program that has a summer camp. And last summer in 2019, they spent their summers studying Princeville. So they came to Princeville. That's them standing at Shiloh Landing. There are residents who provided tours and gave them historical information. And so making that connection, and for pay, not for free. So people were compensated for organizing and developing these tours. This is the Museum and Welcome Center, which used to be really a spectacular renovation that told the whole story of Princeville. They had an incredible exhibit in the front. It was destroyed in Hurricane Matthew and is very slow to restoration and growth. It also, if you really look at it, is a modified Rosenwald school. And so for people who are into preservation and history, Julius Rosenwald, chair of Sears and Roebuck Company, was great friends with Booker T. Washington. They took a tour through the South and saw the disparity between Black and white school facilities. Rosenwald starts the Rosenwald Fund, which provides matching grants for Black communities at that time to build state-of-the-art school facilities. And North Carolina has the highest number of Rosenwald schools in the South. And in this one, Princeville, again, indicative of their historical strength, did not take the in-kind. They raised all the money themselves and built it themselves. And so it stands as sort of an icon. It was once the town hall. It was a school, town hall, a museum, a welcome center. But it was interesting with the kids because they were really interested in this structure. They were really interested in the museum, but they were very disappointed that none of the exhibits existed because of the water damage. And so that became a prompt for how to fill the gap until they get those resources. And we worked with the School of Architecture and the College of Design with their design build studio. Ellen Castley, Durham hero, was one of the teachers in this particular class. How can we create what we ended up calling a mobile museum? So the ability to have a museum on wheels that celebrated Princeville history. You could see the brand on the outside so people can see why it was significant. But on the inside, allowed people to create their own exhibits. This is one of these situations where, you know, you could park it in front of the current museum until the current museum is ready to run and build that place sort of pattern of going to that place to learn about Princeville, or you could take it to the state capitol, or you could take it to the Museum of African American History. It's totally up to them. And so it's really been an important new asset that helped them at least coalesce in the meantime with a resource that helps them amplify their history. In addition, you know, a lot of other things, service projects. This is all of us out there, you know, doing a beautification project to the front of their town hall. But, you know, this idea of these small incremental elements that help to build their capacity, help to maintain their social cohesion, help communicate that this place matters and is important. And I don't know the impacts yet of coronavirus on this event, but this was going to become the first Princeville homecoming, August 1st in Princeville. We're a collaboration with a lot of other partners to do a Black farm tour around the region and then sort of end up in Princeville to engage in a number of cultural activities. So hopefully this is still going if able. But it's really started to take on a new life since that thing has occurred. And to close out Princeville, the thing that it occurred to us that may also be helpful to Durham and to other communities is to really acknowledge the role that North Carolina played historically and in politics. That Princeville's in what was called the Black Second, which was the birth of so many leaders in the Congress. And overlaid with other systems, so the African American music trails, which are being championed by the African American Heritage Commission, the Freedom Road Trail site. You know, there are other kinds of assets that may not be on that site or within that town, but had a very strong connection and a very strong relationship to that. And so this idea of thinking about, for example, Durham's preservation from the standpoint of race, as sometimes, you know, even being larger, you know, to the county or to the district or to the state or even larger scales was a lesson we learned. I want to close out and then open up for questions, but I want to close out with something that we're thinking about a lot now and trying to contribute to, which is when we talk about physical places and built environments, we usually measure impacts based on economics, based on money. And I know I led off talking about the disparities in household income and how everything contributes to that. But that is not to suggest that there aren't other capitals, there aren't other things that we can impact and we can move towards. And this group, Reimagining the Civic Commons, which comes out of the Knight Foundation, has talked about measuring it. Now, their interest has been public realm, public space, but they've been really trying to find ways to encourage people to be mindful of other things other than just the dollars and cents impacts of what people do. And so, you know, these 4 terms are things that we're really looking at hard now. You know, how does the work that we do enhance civic engagement, and how can we build sort of a ladder to help people move up in that regard? Social economic mixing. So in public spaces, you know, if you see, I would say, disproportionate numbers of folks in public spaces, it should be a trigger to say, hey, you know, what's going on here? And in other areas, you know, the idea that people of different incomes and different parts and walks of life can feel comfortable at home, at peace in the same place is an emerging measure that we're all trying to figure out. Environmental sustainability, I'm a landscape architect, so I'm a tree hugger, so that's always important. And value creation, so the idea that how do the investments that are made in communities impact local residents, local businesses, actually increase their quality of life while they're there. And just to really close out, this brings up an experience I had in New Orleans several years ago, still recovering from Hurricane Katrina, among other things. But the Gulf Coast Housing Partnership, which reminded me a bit of what self-help does in our own backyard. Their long-term investment on Aretha Castle Haley Boulevard, Aretha Castle Haley, a prominent historical figure, particularly in politics in New Orleans. And so how they've been able to sustain slow, incremental, but substantial reinvestment on this corridor since Katrina. And so, developing cultural centers and old buildings, creating youth employment projects with bikes by occupying restored historic buildings. But, this is really I wanted to share with in closing is they keep track of a lot of things that we really don't. So they talk about property taxes and how as places increase in value due to their investments in historic properties, it's resulting in more money for school districts, more money for other elements that are important to the community. The impact on home values and home loans, facade renewal grants, they track that every year. Blight and vacancy, which is a major issue. It's very hard for some people to even know who owns what and if anybody's there in some communities, but they actually track that. The impact on police calls. I can go on and on. Voting, I thought was interesting. They started to track how investments in the neighborhood has resulted in how many people have participated, an indicator of civic engagement. But in total, the shocker with the whole thing is that since they've been working, they've displaced nobody. Nobody has been forced to move over 10 years from this reinvestment. They've managed to find ways to compensate for the other dynamics and address that head on, the issue of the economic implications of reinvesting in historic and preservation efforts in the community. So we think that they're a really interesting case and would like to encourage others to take a look at what they're doing and see how that applies where we are. With that, that's the end. Happy to entertain any questions, get into any conversation, any dialogue. Appreciate you all paying attention.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Kofi. I think that was just a wealth of knowledge and information. I probably should have made you go a whole hour, but that was great. I feel like we have a long way to go here at Preservation Durham. So at any rate, I'll go ahead and there are some questions, and I'll go ahead and get started with those. So Aya Shabu, she asks, what is a reasonable ask for gentrifiers of Black neighborhoods in Durham towards preservation?
Reasonable ask for gentrifiers in Durham for what? Say it one more time. I'm sorry.
What is a reasonable ask for gentrifiers of Black neighborhoods in Durham towards preservation?
That's a really complicated question. There are a lot of layers to it. There are a lot of layers to it. I think, part of what I experienced as a resident, particularly in Southeast Durham, North Central East Durham, East Durham, is people concerned that they didn't have a relationship with new neighbors. So one ask would be social, so getting to know your neighbors and reaching out and being engaged in community life and not necessarily just treating the home that's being purchased as a property, but as an investment in a community. And so there's some soft skills, I would say, that might be in play. That would be a great give back. I think that, the issue of housing affordability, which is touched on in this, is a major issue and goes beyond sort of the boundaries of a specific community. That affordable housing is sort of a regional issue. So I think it's sort of advocacy at that level figuring out how to invest your time or your resources or your energy into those regional efforts. And so the preservation of legacy housing overlays with that. I think that in some cases, particularly the city of Durham, they see this sort of huge trend of demand, and they're trying to meet that demand by producing new housing for new residents who are coming with more income, and the reinvestment in legacy housing, meaning existing housing, and stability, so the ability to stabilize existing populations in those places is a major issue. But I do think that you know, it's a multi-tiered kind of thing. I wish I had the magic bullet. I don't, but I think that there's several things that can be done.
Yeah, I think we all wish we had the magic answer, but that was good. John Shelp asked, this is very, well, he stated this is very cool. He complimented you. And he asked if we could get a map of the South Park Heritage Tour online. Is that something available online?
You know what? It is not, but I'm happy to share some links. I remember John from Old West Durham. I
Yes.
think when I first got to Durham, yeah, I think he's one of the first people I met. So it's good to hear from John again. Yes, I can make that available. I'll share it with April, and then she can make it available to everybody.
Okay. Aya asked another question. She wants to know, what is it about North Carolina African American communities that they had so many firsts in education? For example, NCC for Negroes, the largest number of Rosenwald schools, first HBCU, etc.
Yeah, that's a hard question too. I have two unconfirmed theories about this, but so I'll share them, but they're not scientific. One is that Virginia and South Carolina have better soil than North Carolina, and so there were more exploitive, repressive practices for Black folks in those states.
Mm.
And that, since we, even though this is, you know, all due respect, I know about you know, there are many plantations and many horrible things have happened in North Carolina, but not to the extent of our neighbors. So I think in some ways it's a little bit of a soil issue in terms of North Carolina having this reputation of being more moderate, being more tolerant. I think that it's been sort of the mechanics of how do we do other things other than just, you know, completely exploit everything around us to compete. So I think there's like an environmental kind of layer to the story. But I also think that, and particularly in Durham, there was so much wealth coming from tobacco. And you know, there are all these stories about in Durham, in particular, the sort of the gentleman's agreement, you know, between the folks in Black Wall Street and, you know, white wealthy folks. All of these sort of end arounds that there's enough to go around. You know, they just didn't want to be, you know, particularly the white folks did not want to be embarrassed in public, which is why you don't see a lot of resistance until you know, the ice cream sit-in and then the Woolworth sit-in in North Carolina. But I think that there were these a lack of the driver for completely wearing people into the ground because you just couldn't do it. And then the other side was after tobacco, really there's just different ways that people could make a living and earn and invest. So in particular in North Carolina, institutions, schools, hospitals, political organizations, like it's just an amazing state from that standpoint.
Great. Oh, and Erin, she just said not just soil, but access to ports limited North Carolina's early exploitation of slaves as well.
Sure.
So Nick Levy, he's one of our board members. He says, "Thank you for the incredible wealth of thought-producing information." He also asked about South Park, but I think you answered that. But he wanted to know was there a mobile app, which might be a good idea to create a mobile app or some other kind of mobile format for folks. He asked, and in terms of ongoing community transformation, does a project like this produce more of the social cohesion you identified as crucial?
You know what? Yes and no. I think that, our work really focused on the elders and the seniors in the community, and their number one priority at that time was preserving their stories and making sure they weren't lost in this whole wave of growth and displacement. We, in the scope of the study, did not do equal time to young people, to other parts of the community. And so for people who value other things, it may not be, the stories and the history. They might want to look forward, or they might want to be more critical of what's there now. We didn't do it. And there are a lot of reasons why. So I guess it's uneven, I guess I would say. I think that we tried to provide a form and a setup and a way of sort of documenting history, but we didn't do equal justice to other aspects of the community that are clearly very important. And we mostly focused on the public realm and on landscape. And so a lot of the forces that are changing that community are private property. And so we didn't have a strategy for that at all. And so if there was a major critique of what we did, that's probably what it is that we had very little impact on what happened on private property.
Okay, he had a follow-up question. How can or does that measure up to the gentrifying pressures described in the New York Times article you opened with?
That's a really good question. I think at the scale of their analysis, and I can send a link to that report, they looked at the entire community. And I have not gone back and traced what we identified as the walk based on their map. I think that from what I remember seeing in their study, the entire community was essentially at the highest level you could get at in terms of the change from low-income Black resident to wealthier white resident, the entire community, irrespective of what was next door or that sort of thing. I think it had everything to do with being so close to downtown Raleigh.
Okay. Janet Combe, Janet had a question I was going to ask, so thank you, Janet. She said, thank you for this presentation. Could you speculate on the impact of COVID? How do you think post-COVID trauma or damage will affect heritage landscapes and places, especially historic Black or people of color places about people of color?
Yeah, it's really, we're all still just sort of taking it in. I have, just on a personal note, I've probably got 10 or 15 people who've gotten infected. 3 of them have died, unfortunately.
Oh, no.
The rest have recovered, which is great. And the majority of them are Black. And, there's a lot of studies going around. In particular, I have a good friend, Justin Garrett Moore in New York, who has been doing mapping of, demographics and COVID outbreaks. And it's a national pattern where, African-American communities in particular are getting the hardest hit. And that's real. So in terms of what to do about it and what the drivers are, there are a lot of competing things. One is, these historic inequities in terms of access to healthcare, access to physical activity, because it seems to prey on people who have what we call pre-existing conditions that are treatable through healthy diets and physical activity. So diabetes and other things, those are all kind of things that kind of magnify the impact. And so, what I'm hopeful about, the hopeful side of my head says, well, it'll force us to do a rethink of, how do we create more opportunities for people to do, long-term sort of preventative care is the best way to describe it. So getting out, feeling safe, being able to walk the street, go to the playground, enjoy nature, have access to healthier food, nutritious diets, and build those systems in. And that, particularly local businesses, Black businesses, homeowners can be first in line to create economic opportunity from that. Because I think that's like a lifelong thing, because there's just unlimited supply of people who need that particular thing. But in the short term, I think it's going to be hard, real hard, because, until there's a vaccine, And until there's more comprehensive testing, I don't see the trend changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
Well, what about our emotional and psychological connection to heritage places? I think one of my fears is that I don't know if it's a I don't know. I go back and forth. I think sometimes I fear that we won't appreciate them because we'll be worried about survival.
Mm,
But then on the other hand, post COVID, when we're free to live again, I believe that we will appreciate them more. I just don't know
mhm,
how if the economy will support it, like how much what would be supported, and I think the last thing to be supported would be heritage places of people of color.
mm.
So I don't know. It's just one of my things that I think about. Someone asked you. They wanted to ask you about your background. They said, "Tell me about your background." You know, when you came on the screen, I just watched a webinar on biophilic cities. So I said, "Is he growing a forest in his house?"
No,
I know
this is
he's
a
into
virtual.
landscape, but
No, this is a virtual background, but it's a real picture. I took this picture. So the background is for 10 years I led a study abroad program to Ghana, West Africa, and worked collaboratively with folks there in College of Design. And so that image is Aburi Gardens, which is a botanical garden on the hills overlooking Accra, which is the capital city of Ghana. So it's about, say, about 90 minutes outside of the city center, but it's yeah, it's looking down the street on the Bury Gardens with some of the huge trees from that period of time. So that's where that background came from.
okay. All right, I think that's all of our questions. Nick Levy, you answered his question. He just wanted to he had a comment. He said the discussion on resiliency and some of the struggles you identified in the Princeville hurricane recovery case
Mm-hmm.
certainly seems pertinent when we think about the long road to recovery from the COVID crisis. So exactly. And you know, I don't
Mm-hmm.
think I knew that much history about Princeville. You talked to me a little bit about it, just as a
Mm-hmm.
neighbor across the street. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's amazing, and we have to think about how these stories get told. And I do want to
Yeah.
ask. I know that you said that Princeville didn't have enough integrity to be listed as a historic, I guess, on the National Register. Is that what
That's
you tried to do?
that's correct. That's correct.
Um, but I don't know if you've tried. I know in Greensboro they had a neighborhood that couldn't be listed, but the heritage was so strong, they created what was called heritage communities. Is that
Okay.
something that Princeville, um, have you guys considered something like that?
No, not
No, you
aware of
hadn't
it.
heard of
So
it?
yeah.
Okay.
Mm-mm. So if you could send it my way, we'd love to take a look at it.
Oh yeah, I'll send you that example. And I thought it was great. Let's see. Looks like somebody just had a question. Okay, it's just a comment. All right. All right. If there are no other questions, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, my name is April Johnson, Executive Director of Preservation Durham. Oh, somebody raised their hand. Hold on. Let's see. Okay. Denise, you know Denise. Denise, she asked, wonderful presentation. Kofi, it was great to see and hear you. Will there be a part two? or will, or will you do this for other cities such as Detroit?
Ah, yeah, my hometown. Uh, I would love to, but yeah, hopefully get a chance to do it. Yes.
Okay. All right. So yes, this video will be recorded. So we will have this recording on our Facebook page as well as our website, Preservation Durham's website and Preservation Durham's YouTube channel, so that you can all go back to it and share it with your friends and family. We have a lot of work to do. I mean, Kofi, you've done way more than I've ever done or thought about. So
Just different,
this is
not
great.
more, just different, just
Well, yeah,
different.
different, more thoughtful. But thank you again for joining us. And for Kofi mentioned sending me some follow-up information. For those of you, John and Nick, I have your contact. But if anyone else wants the copy, the link of the Heritage, was it South Park Heritage Trail in Raleigh,
Mhm.
and the study, the New York Times, from the New York Times article,
Yeah, I'll share
email
those.
me.
Mhm.
Yeah, email me at april@preservationdurham.org, and I will send you those things if you are interested. All right. Thank you again. Feel free to also donate towards Preservation Durham on our website. We still need your support. Um, it's it's different now, trying to do everything virtually, but continue to support the organization so that we can do more things like this. Also, look forward to we will have another People Plus Place speaker series with Christine Green. She wrote the book Our Separate Ways. That will be on May 28th. So look out for that date for that coming up. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kofi.
Thank you, April.
Bye.